So first of all, I should introduce myself. My name is Michael James. I'm a forest school practitioner. I've worked I'm into my third decade now, like quite a bit over 20 years now, working with autistic people in a variety of settings. But over the last 10 years or so, it's been mainly focused on forest school. I wrote a book called Forest School and Autism. And I've been quite involved in a lot of discussions about how practice develops and things like that, really. So that's who I am. Do you like to introduce yourself, Andy?
Yeah, hi, nice to see everyone. I'm Andy, I'm autistic. I run Spectrum Gaming, which is an online community for autistic young people. But we also have a forest school that we've run for the last 2 years. My journey with forest school started when I read Michael's book 5 years ago. When I knew nothing about forest school, I fell in love with it. Then in 2018, we spoke at the National Forest School Conference together, and that solidified my dream of making a forest school. And then 2 years later, which is quite a long time, we made it happen. So we've run a forest school for autistic young people for the past 2 years. So yeah.
Thanks, Andy. So in our talk tonight, we're going to talk about the 10 things that we decided that you need to know about autism and forest school. Now, there's going to be a lot more than 10 things if you think about it. And also, we'll be going through slides where on each line on the slide, there'll probably be a subject you could actually write a PhD about if you wanted to. This is kind of the nature of things, is that the further you dig into the subject of autism at forest school, the more there is, really. So I think the thing to take really from tonight's talk is any bits that you see that you're interested in, pull them out, dig in deeper, do some research. We'll send a link out to everybody about the Autism and Forest School Discord group, which is a really good place to see other links and to ask questions and things and to be involved in the whole conversation about how practice develops. So here we are, let's go. 10 things you need to know about autism and forest school. There's a slight lag between me pressing the button and it coming on.
Is it working for you?
No.
Okay, if you try now. It'll work now. It's because I unshared my screen. It's fine now.
Oh, cool. Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry about that, everyone. Right. So number one is when forest school works well, it works. So autistic people have been involved in forest school ever since it first began. I noticed when you were introducing yourself, some of you work with SEND learners. At Bridgewater College, I did my training at Bridgewater, and when the people came back from Denmark, the early years students at Bridgewater College introduced forest school to the UK. After they worked with their early years groups, the next group involved were the SEND students from forest school. So SEND students are part of the origin story of forest school. There's nothing new about what we're doing. It's been going on for years. What's new is that there seems to be more and more of a conversation about it now than there used to be. To put it in some kind of context, I think it's always quite good to remember that forest school wasn't created as a therapy or an intervention. I think it's perfectly valid for forest school to be used like that, but actually the reason that kind of developed and that people found that it worked as an intervention was because forest school, in our ethos and our values, offers a more inclusive pedagogy. The values of forest school and our practice actually incorporate different types of people much better than some other ways of working, I think, I would argue anyway. Andy.
So for this section, I just wanted to add some quotes from people who attend our forest school. Sorry if I'm moving around a lot. I'm really, really excited that so many people are here because I just think forest school is magical and want more autistic people to experience it. And these quotes explain why. So these are quotes from our young people and parents recently. So one person said, "I made my first ever friend at forest school." One said, "It's impossible to put into words the impact that forest school has. Meeting other kids and feeling a part of something great has had a massive impact. I would say that without forest school, school, my son will be so isolated and misunderstood. He's learned to accept himself for who he is and to be proud. I've got lots of quotes, so I'll move on to the next one. So, he can still feel negative about being autistic at times, especially when struggling so much with school. Being a member of Spectrum Gaming is the one thing that has changed his negative perception through meeting others that he says are like him, feeling accepted by other young people and chatting with Andy. I think, yeah, but when we say forest school works for everyone, it works. I think it's really important to not underestimate the incredible impact that it can have. There's people who started our sessions who have said that they had no friends, or felt really lonely or really isolated. But then when you follow the forest school principles of putting young people in the lead, then you make a setting where people feel accepted and able to be themselves, where it's okay to be different. And just like nature's always different as well, that can have a really, really huge positive well-being on young people. It's quite difficult to measure the impact that it has, but I just wanted to share some quotes to show that it is actually really powerful. This is you, Michael. Yeah.
So the second thing I think you need to know about is the triangle of trust. This is a big deal. If ever you've heard me talk before, you've heard me talk about the triangle of trust. When I read the book Forest School for All by Dr. Sarah Knight, this phrase, out of almost everything else, it's a great book, but this phrase out of everything in it really jumped out at me as somebody who was already working with autistic people. It's all about the relationships that we have and that we form at Forest School, and about how this affects our practice. For me, this is the absolute foundation. I think everybody who works at Forest School should be aware of this idea of the triangle of trust. So basically, it's looking at this triangular relationship between the practitioner, the learner, and the environment. Hello, Caroline. So we've got the triangle of trust, the learner, the practitioner, and the environment. It's quite an equal relationship, and each corner of this is equally important to the others. And I think if you already work with autistic people, this will probably jump out at you as well. It's quite interesting how many light bulb moments there are between what's good autism practice and what's already part of the Forest School ethos. Understanding the importance of this kind of relationship, not only with one another, but also with the environment that we're in, is really important. So we talk about learner-led practice. This is really key to when we look at the relationship between the practitioner and the learner. So when we look at learner-led practice, what you'll find is that there's a flat about power balance between the practitioner and the learner. That's a very key part of working with autistic people. As we go in on through our talk today, if you keep relating what we talk about back to these ideas in the triangle of trust, you'll find how relevant it really is to everything you do. The flatter power balance, there's also an assumption of competence in making decisions for yourself. This is really important, particularly when you work with anybody who has a perceived disability. Assuming that they have competence and they can make choices for themselves, and capacity is a really important principle to have in your work. And perhaps the most important bit of it all is that you're working with intrinsic motivation. So in learner-led practice, you're not looking for rewards or punishments in order to encourage people to learn and to focus. You're trying to find what intrinsically interests them, and that's the basis of everything. And as we go through our talk, you'll see how important that is when you work with autistic young people. So this is a quote when we think about the environment from Dr. Luke Bearden. Dr. Luke Bearden runs the autism course at Sheffield Hallam University. Autism plus the environment equals the outcome. That outcome might be positive or negative, but the person who's autistic remains the same. It's the environment which leads to the outcome. So this is definitely true of Forest School. And I think a lot of the reasons that Forest School can work is due to the fact that we have this focus on the environment where it takes place. So let's break down what we're talking about when we consider the environment. So the environment, you've got the physical and sensory environment. We're going to talk a little bit later in the talk about the sensory environment a bit more. The physicality of Forest School, I think, is really important. the fact that you're moving, that you're using your whole body, that's a really important thing. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well as we go on. We'll go into a bit more detail. Perhaps one of the greatest things that we have in the environment forest school is space. So we have physical space. Physical space is something that I really feel in my sessions makes my life a lot easier for the people that I work with. So it's a space to meet sensory and physical needs. Sometimes people need to really be able to move in order to regulate themselves, in order to meet their sensory needs and their physical needs. They need to have a lot of space. That may be to burn off energy, to seek proprioceptive input, lots of different things, to stim. I think if you've heard of stimming, if you haven't heard of stimming, stimming is basically movements like sensory stimuli that autistic people will use in order to regulate themselves, to feel better, to calm. Some people have really big stims. If we were doing this in a hall where you could see me, I would be leaping about at this point and really jumping up and down and waving my arms, and I'd be showing you a big stim. It's really difficult to do that in a confined space in a classroom and things, but we've got lots of space for that in the woods. So that's one of the things, is physical space. You've also got the space to move away from things that are difficult. So that may be sensory stimuli. There might be noises you don't like that you can move away from. There might be touching something you don't like. You don't have to do it. You can move away from it. And also you can move towards interesting stimuli. So we can do quite a good job of actually observing people, seeing what they like, what they don't like, how we can help them to kind of feel balanced. Space also gives people more control of their social interactions. So you can actually get away from people who you may be struggling with, or you can choose to join in and talk when you want to, and then you can seek an activity on your own if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by that. That's a really key thing that we've got, that physical space. And just the sheer physicality of forest school is a chance for a lot of non-verbal communication. So often when we talk about autism, people used to always talk about the triad of impairment, which were the difficulties that people may have. But actually, there's lots of ways that autistic people can communicate really well outside of the sort of verbal language, body language, all the kind of things that some people may find difficult. So at forest school, you find that we have things like objects of reference, parallel play. There's a technique, if you work with people who also have learning disabilities, it's really worth learning more about intensive interaction. That takes space. That's actually kind of interacting with somebody, kind of copying the physical movements, but then moving that into kind of a dialogue between the two of you. There's also things just like visual instructions. So it might be like showing someone a saw if it's time to saw something. All of these things can happen naturally anyway. So they're not really forced in the way they might be in some other settings. They're just part of the general to and fro of forest school. And they're not even something that's even necessarily something you would just do with your autistic learners. All of these things are perfectly appropriate ways for everybody to be communicating with each other, really. The other thing, when we consider space, is a space we have in time. This is really important, I think. So Sarah Knight, who you can tell I'm a bit of a fan of Sarah Knight. Sarah Knight said, "It would seem that in forest school, there is a pedagogy of time, a formal recognition of its importance. It is recognised that activities should not be rushed. They take as long as they need to take and can be returned to in subsequent weeks." So this idea of a pedagogy of time is a key to building the trust that we've described, because trust isn't something that can be rushed. Trust is something you have to earn. And really, if you can achieve that kind of triangular trust that we're talking about, that then creates an optimal space where people can learn, where people can communicate, where people are going to feel more comfortable. You really need to have to kind of establish this, and it's something that can take time. For some people, it can happen really quickly. For some people, it's a very slow process. So this idea that you have time, that you don't have to rush things, is really important. It's very important if you're working with people who may be experiencing quite a lot of anxiety. There are some people who end up in forest school because they've been through quite traumatic experiences, ended up in alternative provision, having had a very bad experience in mainstream school sometimes. And for these people, it's really important that people have space. They have that space in time You don't have to rush things. This is such a vital bit of what we do. There's also the fact that we can, when we have this space and time, we're able to fine tune the amount of demands that we put on people. So you can actually completely remove demands from somebody. It's okay to come to Forest School and have a session where you just sit by the fire, if that's what you need to do on that day. We don't have to be pushing to get a particular outcome, a particular product by the end of our session. You can give people that space to actually, if they need to, just to have a more chilled session, or you can have a lot to do for some people if that's what they need. They can make that choice themselves, they can regulate that themselves, and we're not under pressure to put demands on them. So you can see that a lot of the things that we have there are things that are already in our Forest School practice that also work really well for autistic people. So I think we need to always think about our social environment as well. This is a very big part of Forest School for everybody who comes, regardless of somebody's neurotype. A lot of Forest School is about learning how to get on, how to accept one another, how to negotiate, how to get around any kind of conflicts of interest we have. This is something that happens in lots of different groups. So for our autistic learners, for some people, there's a lot of really great learning that can happen there. For some people, depending on how they feel, a lot of the sessions that I do now are actually one-to-one. So it's a very small group. It might be me, a person who's come to support the learner and the learner in the woods. So it's still a group, but it's basically like a one-to-one session. That's useful for people who find a bigger social group more overwhelming sometimes if they've had a hard time in other settings. But also for a lot of people, it's a great fun way to interact with other people. You can help people to kind of learn strategies to get around any kind of social things that they might find difficult. People can learn a bit of self-regulation skills as well. That's something that isn't, this is all of these kind of conversations in Forest School go on about all learners. It's not something that is just concentrated on the autistic children need to learn this. It's actually something that in the conversation about Forest School in general, if you follow things like Forest School podcast or anything, you'll find these terms are used about everyone who comes, and all these kind of skills we think about how to help it with everyone. So it's not a question of separating anybody. It's very inclusive. Sometimes for people who come along with higher support needs, it's actually their staff who need to do most of the learning. So sometimes, I mean, there's quite a high turnover of kind of TAs and support staff with some services. So actually your Forest School sessions may be one of the more constant, consistent, reliable things that are going on for somebody. And it can be quite a good way to encourage supporting staff to see the ways that somebody can self-regulate, to recognise their different communication in that interaction at Forest School. If you have a longer session, sometimes you can actually end up being being a consistent thing in some people's lives. And also, maybe most importantly, Forest School gives a lot of people a chance to do well. Sometimes, you know, the setting, as we heard from Luke Bearden, if the environment changes, sometimes people can thrive. Now, this certainly isn't the case for all autistic people. I'm not a believer that if you take someone into the woods, everything will be much easier for them. That just isn't the case. However, for some people, they really do thrive in the woods. Quite a few of the people that I work with now are just much happier being at Forest School. So I think it's a great opportunity that we offer people. And it's really important for those people who may find it difficult in other settings, that their peers, their staff, and most important of all themselves, see all the things that they can do and see them actually achieve things and value the different skills and things that they have to offer. So we're going to have some time at the end to have questions. So I'm just going to kind of move along. But this is one of the most important things. Or if you always bring yourself back to basically reflecting on almost everything you do at Forest School and the triangle of trust, am I managing to maintain those trusting relationships? Andy, would you like to add anything to that?
I think you summed it up pretty well. No, I don't think so. No. So the third thing that I want everyone to know is we've preparation, because we can't underestimate how important preparation is. And I've shared a few concepts for people to think about. The first one is about uncertainty. A lot of people say autistic people hate change. I personally don't believe that's true. I think it's the uncertainty that comes with the change that causes a lot of anxiety. And what I always say is, it's if you're doing something and you don't have all the information, it can feel like you have a jigsaw, but you have one piece missing from a jigsaw, and you're so frustrated because you have no idea where it is and can't find it anywhere. But then if you're really stressed or really anxious, it's natural instinct to then overthink and then think the worst case scenarios, and that catastrophic thinking takes place. And what happens with me personally is whenever I'm doing something new and I'm uncertain about something, my brain tries to think about everything that could possibly happen and then tries to make safety plans for in case any of those things do happen. So the more uncertainty you have, the more you have to think about. So for example, something really simple like my friend asked me if I wanted to go to the cinema. And if I say yes, most people would already have an assumption of how they're going to get there, what's going to happen, the sort of general flow of it. But then for me, I feel like I need to know everything. So how am I going to get there? What movie are we going to watch? Where are we going to sit in the cinema? And then based on how much information I have determines how many things I have to think about. So if my friend messaged me and said, we're going to watch Iron Man. I don't know why I said that. I don't like Iron Man. We're going to watch Iron Man. We're going to sit at the back seat so we can meet there 5 minutes early. Then the only thing I have to think about is, am I going to walk there? Am I going to get a bus? Are they going to pick me up? That's 3 different things to think about. And I can work out the pros and cons of each and work out what to do. If you didn't tell me any of those things, then I have the options of, can I walk? And then where are we going to sit? Front, middle, or back? What helps with each of those things? And then also the extra things on top of that, which I also haven't processed. So if you work it out, that's actually 27 different possible options that could happen out of those 3 different choices. Does that make sense? But the point is, the more uncertainty you have, the more it sort of explodes thinking about more and more possibilities. So having the least amount of uncertainty as possible is really, really helpful for making sure that you feel the least amount of anxiety. But it's not as simple as that, because the other thing is about having lots of flexibility. Because if someone's really stressed or really anxious, that then makes you feel like you really need to be in control, and having demands and things that you have to do can feel like a threat when you're feeling really stressed. So it's not always that simple. The other thing I was going to mention here is one thing to think about when it comes to flexibility. One thing I think everyone should always do is always have a plan B or a backup option. When we have our forest school, with each young person, I speak to them and say, if you're struggling or things aren't going to go well, what would you like to do? And then each person has their own individual plan. One person goes to a quiet space. One person wants to go on a little walk around the sort of area that we're in. One person wants to go on a 5-minute walk and get a hot chocolate. But having those plans are really, really important, because for a lot of young people, having a backup plan in place reduces their anxiety enough to actually come along and attend in the first place, because otherwise your anxiety might be too high to actually access it. The other thing to consider as well is, if you attend a session and you feel like there's no way out, your anxiety will be higher, and it's much more difficult to feel comfortable and calm and relaxed. So often, like I said, all of our young people have backup plans at the sessions, but most of the time they're never actually needed. But actually having it in place is the reason why they're not needed, which is really interesting. But I'm not, does that make sense? Yeah. The other thing that I've put here, I've written, is inflexibility an autistic trait, because often that's written as part of a diagnostic criteria for autism. But I don't always think that's necessarily true. As I just said, if you're highly stressed, you feel more of a need to be in control, and that's when you can become quite inflexible. But actually, if we flip it the other way around, it's often other people who aren't very flexible when it comes to what autistic people need. For example, I'm very sensitive to lights. When I worked at my job at the local authority, I was allowed to have my hood up and sunglasses if it got too bright. When I was at school, I wasn't allowed to do that. So then I had a blinding light making me feel uncomfortable and leaving me with headaches very frequently, because people weren't willing to make a little change that made me feel a lot more comfortable. Another thing to consider here is, there's someone at our forest school where I bring a trolley full of equipment and walk for an hour to go and get it set up. And one of the young people loves, when he comes to a session, putting everything he can into the trolley, pulling it and just running as far as he can. For a lot of people, that's really inconvenient. If I've got stuff in there I need, when I'm chasing after him through the woods, and it's it's a nightmare sometimes. But then what I think about time is him doing that actually harming anyone? And what is the reason behind it? So from knowing that young person, he is very he's a big sensory seeker. So that's what he needs in order to regulate. So even though it's something that's could be considered inappropriate by some people, actually, in my view, the need for regulation is more important than whether it's considered inappropriate or not, if that makes sense. Autistic people have sensory differences and act and behave in different ways to other people. I think it's really important that people are allowed to be how their body is telling them to be. And yeah, that's a key point for that bit. But I've also shared a bit of a conundrum here, because if people dislike uncertainty, but also dislike it when things are too rigid, what do you actually do? Well, what I really believe in is having what we call semi-structured practice. I put a really stupid picture in there. I don't know why. I wanted to post this just in case. So the way we run our sessions is we put young people in the lead. They decide exactly what happens in the sessions, how we run. But we put lots of planning behind the sessions. So we have structure and plans and activities that we can do just in case they're needed. Forest School works best when young people are in the lead. But if someone is feeling really anxious, they might need a bit more support and a bit more structure. So if you have things prepared, you're then able to offer that. But inherently, it works best when there's no demands placed on young people, so they can do what they feel they want to do at that time. So when we run our sessions, I actually send a document out to all of our young people who attend, with a few things on. The first thing is saying it's semi-structured, everything is optional, you don't have to do anything you're uncomfortable with. But then also share possibilities for structure if people need it. So every time I say the equipment that we're bringing along, we have planned activities based on the equipment. So if we're bringing, saws, then we can make things out of wood. If we don't, then we can't. We also have activities that, so with the planned activities, at certain times of the day, we'll come around and say, does anyone want to come and do this thing? And people can choose whether to or not. We also have activities that are available upon request. So if people wanted to do some whittling or something like that, they know the key contact person to go to and speak to about that. And the other thing we've got is just a list of activities and games that people love. So we've written a long list of games together. We went on a group call together and came up with all of our favorites, put them on a document, and then said, if you're stuck for knowing what to do, here's some games. Just ask a leader if you want someone to run it. Every single session, without fail, the game that's been requested is a game that they invented called Shrek Hide and Seek, where I drink some transformation juice, I fall asleep for 100 seconds, I wake up as Shrek, and I run around trying to eat everyone. But that's what they enjoy. So yeah. Final thing to mention on this section for me before passing over to Michael is, I believe when working with young people, the process is more important than the outcome. Even if you feel you have the perfect things that you know will work, if you make the perfect quiet space to go to when someone's overwhelmed, I think what's really, really key is making sure the people who attend your sessions have meaningful involvement in deciding what that is. When we set up our forest school, what I did was I told young people our budget, we went on call together, and they decided what we're going to buy, how it's set up, what the space will look like. In my opinion, I could have come up with something better if I did it on my own. But the reason why this is so important is if you're working in partnership, you're not just getting the things that are in the space, you also get a huge level of extra trust and respect. And that completely trumps the benefits of having a place that feels a bit better to me, if that makes sense. And as Michael said, with a triangle of trust, having strong relationships with people is the most important thing. So yeah, with you.
Thanks, Andy. So some of the groups that I work with are sort of young adults who also have learning disabilities, so that everybody has an autistic diagnosis, but people also have a diagnosis of learning disabilities to different degrees. So these are some of the considerations and preparation if I have a new learner come in, I thought I'd share with you. The most important question always is the same, really, regardless of what kind of learner you have, is the most important question is, what does the learner need from you? So this is the first thing to ask people, what do you need from me, really? This is the, the underlying principle of your preparation. You then need to consider what's the best way to ask for this. So with the groups that I work with, people have support staff as well as themselves. So you have to think about your communication, but you also have to think about the fact that you're communicating with your learner. So even though the communication may be going through a member of support staff, what's important is that the learner is as involved in that communication as they can be. You should be encouraging self-advocacy, I think. I think this is an important point. This should really be in whatever way you can in your initial preparation. You should be trying to find out how the learner feels about things. You should be encouraging them to be able to say that they don't like things as well as that they do like things. You should be trying to make sure that that they have as much kind of input into the whole process of preparation as they're able to or interested in having. It's always trying to move away from just having staff tell you what somebody wants. You need to see what efforts are you making to make sure that that person gets to do it. Establishing partnership and communication. I mean, as Andy says, that one of the most important partners, or the most important partner, is the learner themselves. But also you need to be trying to get good communication with their support teams, maybe with their parents, with the teachers at school, with any other professionals, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists. If you can manage to get communication to some degree, even to just to check in and say, you know, Michael's starting Forest School in a couple of weeks. I've heard you're his occupational therapist. Is there anything you think that I should know about before he comes? That can be really helpful too. So here's an example of some of the questions that I'd be asking and how I'd be doing it. So always address questions to the learner, unless it's you're having a separate conversation, perhaps with an occupational therapist or the teacher. Any kind of questionnaire you put out, you need to make sure that you're addressing the learner directly, and then perhaps have a little bit at the end saying, if somebody helped you fill this in, can they say who they are? Use accessible formats. So here in the UK, it's often Easy Read will be used by a lot of certainly older children and also adults with learning disabilities. Easy Read is a program that kind of prints widgets that people can read together with the actual words. It makes it a lot easier for a lot of people to understand. I think Easy Read is quite expensive to get for yourself. If you're doing a lot of work with SEND groups, it's worth paying to get Easy Read. But if you are working together with schools or any kind of adult services, they should have an Easy Read program. And if you ask them, they should be able to help you to get an Easy Read questionnaire together if that's how you're going to communicate with somebody. You need to find out about how someone prefers to communicate. So if someone has a PEC system, which is basically photographs that people put to make schedules and to communicate and to ask for things that they want or need, do you need to provide any PECs before they come? You need to ask, is there any photos you need to add to someone's PECs book, to add to choice boards and things? Can you use Makaton? So Makaton, for anybody who doesn't know, is sign language. It's basically people who do BSL sometimes tell you that it isn't a language, it's a communication tool. But basically Makaton is communicating through signing. If you don't know any Makaton yourself, if you go on YouTube or online and just type in Makaton for fire or Makaton for woods, you'll find there's loads of really lovely people who share Makaton signs online, so you should be able to actually find them. In this area, kind of, I live in the southwest of England, there are sometimes Makaton courses, particularly for, set up particularly for forest school leaders. If you get the chance to go on one of those, I'd really recommend it. Another important bit, if you're working with learning disabled people, is to find out if there are any responses to echolalia or any trigger words you should know. So echolalia will be a kind of set verbal routine, or sometimes one of the ways of echolalia is sometimes a set verbal routine that people have where they'll expect certain responses from you. So there's one man who I work with has a whole kind of series of responses, like you have to say Christmas and he says McDonald's, and you say in Manchester, and And if you learn that, it's a really good way to actually make friends with that person, to build those kind of trusting relationships. Also, some people have trigger words that cause them a lot of anxiety. These can be quite unexpected words, but if someone hears them said, so it's worth asking, are there any echolalic responses that I need to know about? Are there any trigger words? So there's also, does someone use visual schedules? Do they need you to provide one? Supporting transition between activities, we're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute, but sometimes that's worth asking about. Does anybody need any particular support moving from one activity to another? You need to consider if there'll be a consistent structure of your sessions. So with my groups, I take the same approach as Andy, which is kind of semi-structured. My idea about structure is that it's like a safety net, and the structure belongs to the learner. I think that's a really key thing. A big mistake that you see is that sometimes supporters, TAs, whoever is accompanying somebody, is actually more rigid with the structure than the person themselves. And they'll be saying, right, well, you have to do this next because it's what it says in your visual schedule, when the person actually maybe wants to explore something else. It's okay for them to do that if you think of the structure as a safety net. And so if someone is looking a little bit lost, a little bit anxious, needs help moving on into another activity, then you have that structure there for those times. But if someone wants to explore something else, try something else, you don't want to be dragging someone back to the structure if it's not necessary. That's would be one of my big tips about that. Sensory profile. If somebody has seen an occupational therapist, they'll probably have a sensory profile, which is really useful for you to know about if you can find anything out about it. That will tell you people's sensory preferences, any aversions, any kind of dysregulation. It's a really important thing to help you know the things that somebody needs at forest school and the things that they don't need. And they may also have like sensory diets. They may do sensory circuits. There's all kinds of things. If there's an occupational therapist involved, I would try to find out what their recommendations are and what work they're doing with somebody. That's really important in forest school. How should you respond if someone's feeling stressed? Do you know any triggers? That's really important. If you've planned that out in advance so that you know already how you should respond if somebody is becoming stressed. Andy's going to talk a little bit more later on about helping people when they become very stressed. If you work with learning disabled people, you really need to be aware of epilepsy. There's a much higher prevalence of epilepsy amongst the learning disabled community than in the general community. So in my groups with autistic adults who also have learning disabilities, almost every group has somebody in it who has epileptic seizures, tonic-clonic seizures quite regularly. So you need to partnership work with whoever, be that their parents, any kind of support services or schools, so that you know what to do if the person has an epileptic seizure. And you need to consider this in your emergency procedure, which we should all have. And you need to be thinking about, well, how would I actually get someone out of the woods if I had to call an ambulance for them? Epilepsy is something that if you work in that field, you can almost become blasé about it, but you really shouldn't, because any epileptic seizure is a potentially very serious thing. And also you need to be thinking about stuff like people being near the fire, walking along tracks, and it's something that I have to consider quite a lot, which is why I've included it here. But yeah, you need to think about that. You need to risk assess, and you need to plan with whatever partners if you do have anybody who's epileptic. So in the introductory sessions, it's just kind of getting to know the place. For some people who've come to mind, even getting out of the car can be quite a big thing. Getting in the car, going to a new activity. The pedagogy of time, you don't need to rush anything. Take things at people's own pace. That would be my biggest thing. So for some people, just getting them to walk from the car park to the woods can take a couple of weeks if they're not somebody who's tried a new activity for a long time. You need to really just kind of understand that pushing people, increasing the demand, there's no failure on your part or on anybody else's part if the first week they come, they get to the car park and they're like, I'm not very sure about this. All you do is see, do they need some more information? Do they need me to send some more photos of what we're going to do? Do they need a social story about it, perhaps? All of these kind of things, just take your time. That's really, really important. and partnership work, basically. Partnership work with the person themselves and try to establish those partnerships with other people. It's not always easy to establish those partnerships with other people. This is kind of one of the ironies, is that sometimes the point where communication breaks down is between the neurotypical professionals rather than with the actual learner themselves. Right. Moving on. So number 4, attention, monotropism and autistic inertia. I think that we really need to talk about this because quite often, if I ever do any public speaking or I'm involved in a workshop, it's a real pattern that I've noticed of people asking questions which are probably, I can't say certainly, but almost probably related to some of the issues around attention and the transition between activities. It doesn't seem to be something that neurotypical people who haven't had much to do with autism really pick up on very easily, maybe don't really seem to know about. So I think it's really important that we talk about that if we're doing forest school. This often looks like things like perhaps somebody who enjoys being at forest school when they're there, but finds it difficult to make the journey from the school or from home to the woods. And there's a lot of difficulty getting them to kind of leave home in the morning, but they're very happy when they're at forest school and they're happy in the morning before they leave home. Sometimes it sounds like there might be a certain point in the session as you come towards the end of the session when somebody becomes upset. And often this, when people have spoken to me about it, is when they've had a great time and then it gets to kind of circle time to pack up, and they suddenly become very upset. If you're noticing these things, then this is probably what it is, but we're going to discuss it a bit more, and you can't be absolutely certain. So there's lots of different theories about autism, and to be honest, when I kind of read some of the different theories, I have found something useful in most of them. Not always all of them, but most of them. But if you're interested in really digging into some of the theories about autism, I would recommend this book, Autism: A New Introduction, Sue Fletcher Watson and Francesca Happe. It's a really accessible book if you are interested in digging that bit deeper into kind of some of the ideas around the theory and current debate with autism. Out of all of the theories, though, the one that I find the most useful and the most practical, and which I think forest school practitioners really need to know about, is called monotropism. Monotropism is a theory that was monotropism is a theory that basically came from autistic researchers. So it was Dr. Dinah Murray, Dr. Wen Lawson, and someone else who I've just forgotten. But yeah, monotropism is really, really what you all need to read about. I'm actually going to give you some homework. Be warned, get your pens ready for your homework assignment at the end of this little section. So because of the way that this works, it's actually gone over the quote. So my face is over the quote and I can't read it, or I don't know it off by heart. But if you read the quote here about monotropism, describing it, this is
Michael, if you use your mouse, you can drag your face out the way. So if you hold click on your mouse and
make me go. Oh yes, I've gone. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks. Actually, Andy's my technical advisor for these things. So in a nutshell, monotropism is a tendency for our interest to pull us in more strongly than most people. It rests on a model of the mind as an interest system. In a monotropic mind, fewer interests tend to be aroused at any time, and they attract more of our processing resources, making it harder to deal with things outside of our current attention tunnel. So this idea of attention tunnels and of being very focused along these attention tunnels, this is really crucial to your understanding, I would say, and it's a very practical way of actually thinking about what you're seeing. We're going to see how it applies in practice in a minute. So another idea, which is also involved with some of the issues around autism and attention, is autistic inertia. So autistic inertia is a term that tends to be used quite a lot in the autistic community, You'll sometimes see it's spoken about using different terms. If you look at kind of, oh, there's a question there, sorry. There's a question there from Leah. So monotropism, it can be like hyperfixating, like it's hyper-focus rather than fixating. So yeah, it's to do with like having quite a hyper-focus on a particular tunnels of attention. So autistic inertia. So you will sometimes see what we're talking about here described in medical, kind of the more medical literature in terms of differences in executive function. Sometimes it'll be described as executive dysfunction, but I've used the term autistic inertia because that's how this is discussed in the autistic community. So it's basically, it's difficulty starting or stopping an activity despite wanting to. It can have quite a few different causes, so it may need different strategies. Some of the possible causes include difficulty in planning. So this is part of the kind of executive function, is working out the steps you need to take to move on and to do whatever it is that you're going to do. So people can feel quite overwhelmed by a complex task. They might have difficulty breaking it down into the little steps that you need to actually do it. Difficulty prioritizing what you're going to have to do. Sometimes not knowing where to start to actually move on and do something. Other times this can be to do with anxieties about moving on to the next task. So rather than a bigger general anxiety, this is anxiety maybe about worrying that there's going to be some kind of imperfection in what somebody does. So somebody might be worried that they're not going to do something quite right. Unpredictability also can cause worry. Other times, sometimes it can be connected with anxieties about an unpleasant sensory, an unpleasant sensory stimuli when they move on into the next thing. Other times it can look as if somebody isn't moving on because they're feeling quite overwhelmed for sensory reasons. So this is another quite distinct, different reason why you might notice this. So sometimes people go into like a sensory shutdown where different sensory channels, by which I mean things like your vision, your hearing or whatever, actually shut down because somebody's feeling overwhelmed. So sometimes if someone isn't responding and moving on, it may be that they've actually been struggling with their sensory processing and they've shut down. That's another possibility when you kind of see something like this. It can be to do with your motivation and your focus. It might be that the task that they're doing, the activity they're doing is just a lot more fun than what they're being offered. That's another possibility as why somebody might have trouble moving on. If you think about monotropism, if you're really deeply in that monotropic tunnel, and you're really hooked into the thing you're focused on, it's going to be quite difficult to do something that just doesn't have the same kind of interest for you. It's going to be hard to move on. It's going to make it harder to get out of that attention tunnel. It can also sometimes be to do with demand avoidance. Andy's going to talk a little bit more about demand avoidance in a little while. What we're talking about now, though, I think it's quite important to make this point, is that this is people who are quite happy, they're not, in their general kind of day, they're having an okay day, they're just finding it hard to move from one thing to another. This is very different from somebody who can no longer engage in the activities that they used to do, who may no longer be managing to go to school. That isn't really what we're talking about when we talk about this kind of attention. If you're seeing those kind of things, you're probably looking at people who are, if not in crisis, on their way into crisis, who are experiencing autistic burnout or who, have needs that are more complex than what we're talking about when we're just kind of transitioning between activities or moving attention. Okay, so it's really important, I think, to make that distinction and not to be thinking, well, they just need to be shown a load of little steps and then they'll be able to get on and do whatever they have to do. If it's somebody who's actually in a state where they're having very high anxiety, depression, this is a different thing that we're talking about now. Okay, I have to make that point. This is really good, this cartoon, as a way of kind of describing how it can feel for some people to switch attention. So when I'm focused on something, my mind sends out a million tendrils of thought. It expands into all of the thoughts and feelings. When I need to switch tasks, I must retract all of the tendrils in my mind. This takes some time. Eventually, I can shift to the new task. But when I'm interrupted or must switch abruptly, it feels like all the tendrils are being ripped out. And that's why I don't react well. Please just give me some time to switch tasks. This is really a nice way to actually see how someone's describing that experience. I think this is something to be really aware of in your sessions when you see people finding it difficult to transition between different parts of the session or in and out of the session. So here are some tips that I would give you about working around attention. So the first, maybe one of the most important things, is to ask yourself, why am I trying to shift the person's attention? So why are you trying to get them to pull all the tendrils out? Do you have to actually move their attention? If you know that somebody is kind of looking like they're really into this attention tunnel, if you already know them quite well and know they're not going to find it easy to shift attention like that or to transition, you need to ask yourself, why am I asking them to do this? Is this something that we need to be doing now? Sometimes it is, but if it isn't necessarily, then maybe just let them stay where they are. The other thing is always, like in the partnership working that we've already discussed, what's in place in other settings to help someone move between different activities. So if there are things that are already working at school or at home, talk to people, find out what they are, use them in your session. So that can be all kinds of different things. Some kind of examples of what that might be. It's a predictable structure, visual prompts. So some people use a timetable or even just time. Some people use egg timers to say when the egg timer's up, then it's time to move on. Sometimes people may have different methods. Sometimes it may be like a kind of a kind of schedule type or social story type thing that breaks down the sequence that someone needs to do to move on into smaller steps. So for instance, it's time for forest school. You need to go and get your waterproofs. You need to put your boots on. You wait here with the other children, and just to break it down into those steps before the class then go to forest school. So sometimes strategies that can help some people with attention may be decluttering what's around them. So sometimes if people have kind of organizational problems, also to do with sensory processing, some people are going to find it harder to focus and to do something if there's a lot of clutter. So obviously, like in the woods, there's loads of stuff, isn't there? Do you know what I mean? There's kind of, if you're looking at the woodland floor to kind of do some kind of craft, so you're working on something, if you're doing it on the ground, even doing it on site, like in my woods, I have kind of homemade woods made hazel benches and things. So these things can actually have quite a lot of visual distraction. The thing to do, if you think it will help and if you notice that, would be just to put a tarp down, just a plain single coloured thing. That might make it easier for somebody to actually focus. Part of the problem of when we discuss possible strategies is that what are great strategies for one person can be really bad strategies for someone else. This is kind of what is actually really difficult about talking about these things like we are today in a general way, is that I kind of know from my own experience that if you did some of the things I've just mentioned with someone who had a really demand avoidant profile, it's actually going to make it worse. It's going to increase the demand, like Andy's already mentioned. So with people who perhaps have a demand avoidant profile, you would be using things like declarative language, cooperative approach, removing demands, and Andy will chat about that a bit more. But it's really important to think about the iceberg model when you think about these things. So what you see above the behavior that you see is the tip of the iceberg. There's all kinds of different things going on beneath the waterline, and they're not all the same. So although what you may think you're seeing above the water is the same, what's going on beneath for that person can be really different from one person to another, and even from one situation to another. So it is complicated, and you need to kind of be very gentle in how you apply these things in practice. So the other important thing is to reflect on your communication. Has the person actually heard what you're saying? Have they understood what you're saying? Are you using the best way of communicating with somebody? Sometimes somebody is going to respond better to Makaton, to objects of reference, to kind of visual types of communication. Are you using the best sensory channel? Sometimes people have difficulty filtering out verbal communication from the background noise. So if there's quite a lot of children playing, there's other noises going on in the woods, it's a bit windy, your voice might actually be harder to process than if you were trying to show something visually. So even while you're saying it, if you're also giving a visual prompt or some kind of visual communication, it doesn't have to be Makaton, it doesn't have to be you know, a kind of schedule. You know, it doesn't have to be one of the more formal types. It can just be using gestures, objects of reference. These are all great ways to actually put across what you're kind of saying to somebody without actually. So you've got that visual communication backing up your verbal communication. Is the request to shift attention perceived as a demand? We've talked about that a little bit already. And also, really importantly, have you allowed time to process? So this can vary even in the same person, depending on their arousal and their environment. We just talked a little bit about kind of background noise and how that can sometimes affect people. So you need to give people a bit of time to process, and don't keep asking somebody using different words. That's a really important thing. If you're talking to somebody, this is a big mistake I think that I made early on when I first started working with autistic people, is that I would ask somebody something, and then if I didn't get a response, I would rephrase the question, which is what we would often do in neurotypical communication. But when I was talking to autistic people, I was just giving them a whole other thing to process and try to understand. So I was just increasing the processing time and making it more difficult to understand what I was actually on about. So another thing that affects attention is how aroused is the person. If the person's becoming very dysregulated or overstimulated, sometimes it can help to redirect to proprioceptive heavy work. So anything that's kind of putting a bit of weight on people's kind of joints, their muscles, that can help people to ground. That's quite calming, and that might bring someone to a level where they can pay attention a little bit better. A really good, nice, gentle tip, which I find really, really useful, is there a natural end to the activity? So a lot of autistic people find it difficult to stop something until it's come to its end. This can apply to all kinds of different things, but if they don't feel that they've seen something through to the point where it's supposed to stop, and they're being asked to stop just at random points along the way, that can be really difficult. So when you think about, for instance, if somebody is fueling the fire, if you say, there's this pile of sticks, when these sticks are finished, then there's enough sticks on the fire. People can see what they're doing. They can count down to actually the end of the activity in a really natural way. I think that's a really good tip. The other tip that might be helpful is thinking in terms of monotropism, thinking about monotropic interest systems. What interest value does the next activity have? We mentioned this a little bit before. If it's a lot less interesting, but you have to do it, like it's time to pack up, how could you make that a bit more interesting? Perhaps you could chat about someone's special interest while you pack up. That could be part of the kind of routine, is that when it's time to pack up, we chat about dinosaurs while we do it. And that will actually help to make that easier to move on into. Perseveration, or getting stuck. So perseveration is the uncontrollable repetition of a thought, phrase, or movement despite the absence or cessation of a stimulus. So this is something that I have seen reports that this is something that neurotypical people struggle with the most when they work with autistic people. I don't know if that's true or how people feel about that. It's never struck me as being one of the more difficult things, but I can understand why some other people really find it difficult. So perseveration is basically when somebody gets stuck in a loop and they really can't get out of it. There are different reasons for perseveration. One thing I would say about it is that sometimes in the literature, you see things that I would describe as really healthy monotropic behaviours, like talking a lot about a special interest, going through kind of echolalic, verbal, kind of structured routines. These are actually quite fine. That isn't somebody who's stuck in a loop. That's just somebody who's basically in their kind of monotropic tunnel, and I don't see that as being any kind of problem at all, and I don't think it should be spoken about as a problem. There are those times when people really do kind of get stuck. They can't get out of that loop of what they're doing. So you need to look, and so first of all, I would also ask yourself what the learner is getting from their perseverative behaviour and how it's making them feel. So this is about how is it making the learner feel, not how is it making you feel. So in points in my career, I've been in situations where somebody has maybe wanted to spend an hour and a half in the evening at the end of their day when they've had a lovely day, listening to the first 2 bars of Thomas the Tank Engine on a loop. Now, being in that environment for me wasn't very easy, but actually for the person who was doing it, it was making them really relaxed. They were really happy. They weren't kind of overstimulated or dysregulated in any way. It was bringing them down, and they were doing what they wanted to do. So you need to actually be asking yourself, this isn't about how this is making me feel. How is it making the learner feel? Now, if the perseveration is escalating anxiety, then the person that's going to need some support, that should probably be focused on de-escalation. Andy will be talking a little bit about that in a little while, but it's sometimes you can manage to distract people, sometimes it's more difficult. Quite often people will have a kind of script in their head, particularly if you're talking about somebody going over and over and trying to process something that's happened that's quite difficult. They might be waiting for a particular response from you before they can move on. It is okay to ask someone in that case, what do you want me to say? What do you want me to do to help? What would you like me to say back to you? And once things reach the conclusion that that person has kind of scripted in their head, they'll find it easier to move on. So that's a tip that might be useful for some people. Again, are there strategies and other settings to help someone manage? That's always really important. If there's a way that helps people to move on when they get into those loops, really you need to be doing that. So one of the things that can be difficult about this way of thinking is that it can encourage kind of rumination in people. So if you ruminate on problems and on kind of stresses, that can have bad effects on your mental health in the long term. So if you can learn ways to actually deal with rumination quite early on and to recognize when you're doing that, that can actually be really quite a useful thing for people as they go on through their life. Now, it's not something that we're going to chat about here, but when I give you your homework, please follow the link if this is something that's ringing a bell for you. And there's a really good article by Sunny Hallett as one of the articles that's on this website. I'd really recommend reading that article about rumination, about some of the ways you can help people to learn how to cope with it. I'm hitting the button. There we go. Right, so we've talked a little bit about some of the problems that might come along with attention and monotropic thinking. It's really important that you don't see things just in the terms of those. I needed to talk about them a bit because it's kind of questions that I've been asked quite a lot before. However, really at Forest School, you need to be really aware of how much monotropic thinking is our friend in the woods. So you'll often hear in Forest School people talk about flow, just generally for all of our learners. So a flow state, also known colloquially as being in the zone, is a mental state in which a person performing some activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement and enjoyment in the process of the activity. So with all learners, we often talk about people getting into a flow state, might be in craft activities and different things that they're doing in the woods. This is a really, really quite a a state that we try to encourage at Forest School as much as possible. We recognise the value of it, but it's also talked quite a lot about in conversations about monotropism. So Dr. Damien Milton, who's a really interesting autistic academic and advocate, he talks about flow quite a lot. And he says that by entering into a monotropic flow state, people on the autism spectrum can gain predictability and control over their immediate environment, a sense of achievement, and in the moment fun. Fun is always really important. So you need to recognize maybe when people are getting into this flow state, into this really down into that monotropic attention tunnel, and see the strength that there can be in that. This is a really optimal state for kind of learning. It's really good for your well-being to spend some time in flow states. So look for ways that you can facilitate that. The biggest way is to sometimes recognize it. I mean, I have one man who comes along, a young man who comes along to kind of sessions with me, and he likes to paint on the side of his tree, and he very much achieves a flow state where he's not really distracted by anything. He's totally in the zone. He's really happy. Sometimes if he's a little bit dysregulated, a little bit unhappy, a little bit stressed looking when he arrives, we offer him paint really early on to see if he wants to do it. And when he paints, he will then be happy for the whole rest of the time he's in the woods. It's really, really something to kind of learn to recognise.
Can I quickly mention something? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So when it comes to flow states, one of the things that gets me into a state like that is actually gaming. But interestingly, what used to happen was when I played with people online, I used to struggle quite a lot, but no one knew I was struggling at that time, because I could be really struggling, not leaving the house, feeling really, really anxious. But then in that moment, if you're doing something that puts you in that flow state, it's like everything else, every other worry sort of vanishes for a little bit. So in that time, you can be really joyful and smiling and laughing and really happy. But when as soon as it ends, you can go back to normal again, if that makes sense. So even if you're immensely struggling, you can still have that flow state. And that's really impactful as well, because if the whole time you're worrying and overthinking about things, it gives you a break from that overthinking. And then you'll overthink it a little less when you go back to it. So yeah, sorry, that was it.
Cool. Thanks, Andy. So everyone really, I think it's kind of a very general knowledge really that a lot of autistic people have special interests, and we can see that in the term of in terms of their monotropic interest, that attention tunnel, when that's focused on something, when you're really hooked into something you're really interested in, you can see how the special interest will then develop for someone who has a monotropic way of thinking. So this is a quote from Dr. Wen Lawson. Dr. Lawson is one of the people who originally came up with the idea of monotropism. Observing and noting what it is we seem fixated on, overtaken by, or not able to let go of, this could be the very means to helping build connections, to learning and understanding in practical ways that help us get through our day. So special interests in the woods are our friends. See how you can incorporate it, give opportunities to talk about it if you can. They're really a key way of building those relationships. We talk about the triangle of trust, the importance of having those relationships. It's a really great way to engage someone, to build a relationship with them, and to kind of maintain that kind of trust and respect for somebody, is to really see special interest not as any kind of obsession or something, but as a passion and as something that you really want to kind of get on board with in your sessions in any way that you can. Which just brings us in a circle back to one of our earlier slides when we talked about the triangle of trust, meeting someone where they are. Can you remember when I talked about this slide earlier, we talked about intrinsic motivation. So we can see that in flow states and in special interests, that is where the intrinsic motivation can often lie for somebody with a monotropic mind. So monotropism, flow states, special interests, these are your friends in the woods. If you really want to get the most out of your sessions for somebody, you need to be trying to look for these things. This is your homework, everyone. This is a website that was set up by Fergus Murray. It's about monotropism. Fergus's mother, Dr. Dinah Murray, was also one of the academics who originally came up with monotropism. This is an absolute treasure trove. All of the articles that are shared here, you will find really useful for you in a practical way for the work you're doing in the woods. Right, so please have a look at this. If you're interested in coming to the talk tonight, you will find this absolutely invaluable. Okay, so let's move on. So there's a bit of a lag between me hitting the button and things happening. Number 5, Forest Park School can be a challenging sensory environment. Now, the reason I think we need to know about this is because the way that Forest School can benefit people in a sensory way, people with sensory processing differences can really get quite a lot from Forest School. And I think that's actually quite well known now. Whenever I look at social media groups or anything, there's often a lot of kind of understanding that actually Forest School is meeting people's sensory needs really well. So I'm not going to concentrate so much on what we're giving people. It is loads, and it's an amazing thing for people. Occupational therapists love Forest School because of all of the kind of sensory benefits that we can bring. But I think we need to talk about the fact that, you know, there can be problems as well. So Forest School is a really rich sensory environment. It's not just the sensory environment of nature, it's also the actual activities we do. So nature can contain all kinds of sensory challenges for people who may be having like differences in their sensory processing, and the activities that we do can as well. So we're going to think a little bit about what some of those things might be. So people's sensory profiles, the particular way that they process sensory information, are very individual, and it's also important that we realise that they fluctuate. So they're not necessarily the same from one session to another. The other thing that's important to think about when we think about the woods is actually the environments that we take into people, that we're taking people into, fluctuate quite a lot. Even over the course of one session, it can go from being quite cloudy to being quite bright light. Andy spoke earlier about how he finds bright light difficult, and so he needs to have a hood up and some sunglasses on to cope with being in bright light. So you need to think about the fact that these things aren't just kind of set. There's a constant fluctuation, a constant interaction, and it's moving all the time. So this is something I think it's worth us all thinking about. What exactly is the Forest School practitioner's role if you're working with learners who have sensory processing differences? I would say it's important for all of us to be aware of the limits of our competency. So sensory profiles, sensory audits, and particularly any kind of sensory intervention, sensory diet, sensory circuits. These are worked on by occupational therapists who specialise in this particular part of occupational therapy. They have done years of postgraduate study in order to qualify to do that. We don't have that same level of competency, so we need to be careful and aware and not trying to say, well, you know, I saw a talk the other day and that said that, you know, if you put someone in a hammock, they'll be really chilled out and that's great. We'll just stick them in a hammock and it will be fine. And if they're upset in the hammock, it must be something else. It's really important that we're kind of aware of the limits of our competency, I think. Okay, so don't be trying to prescribe things for any of your learners. If you are an occupational therapist or you've had particular training, that's fine. But if you haven't, then just be a little bit aware that there's a huge amount to of knowledge kind of goes behind a lot of the kind of ways of working with people with sensory processing differences. So partnership working, if there is an occupational therapist involved with somebody already, it's really good if you can manage to check in with them, whether it's directly if possible, or even via kind of parents or teaching staff, support staff. It's good for them to kind of, in fact, OTs often really like coming to the woods actually to do observations and things. They do seem to be very keen on Forest School in general, the occupational therapists that I've always met. So if possible, if you can do any partnership working with an occupational therapist or kind of secondhand hear about the recommendations and things they've made, that's great. Because we're working with children, often someone may not have actually had that kind of input yet. So people may be picking up that there might be something different about someone's sensory processing, but it hasn't actually got through the referral process, that they haven't started to see an occupational therapist and kind of observations haven't been made. Actually, in that situation, the stuff you're doing in the woods can be really vital. if you observe and record how somebody is moving through the woods, just little things that you notice, even how somebody's walking, kind of how much pressure somebody puts, if they're kind of soaring or if they're doing leaf rubbings with a crayon or anything like that. All of these little observations about how somebody's moving through the woods, how they're seeing the noises that they like, that they don't like, the noises that they make. These things can all be really, really important to share with the occupational therapist when they start to do the sensory profile for somebody, if they do later on. So observe and record sensory observations as much as you can. You also need to be thinking a lot of the ways to actually give somebody stimulus that they need in the woods are going to be part of forest school anyway. They're all going to be there. They're either part of the woods, or you may have activities like tree swings, hammocks, a lot of kind of carrying things around, climbing. The things that are going to give people stimuli tend to already be there. It's worth considering the ways that you could take away stimuli if you need to for somebody. That's really, so sometimes that might be, you know, things that people take with them, but you need to be thinking as well, in the woods, how would I create a space where somebody wouldn't be seeing loads, you know, for instance. So I think people are kind of tend to be really well aware of this. So I'm going to go through it really quickly in case there's anyone who's never kind of considered the senses before. Apologies to lots of people who I'm sure are here and know all about this already. So when we talk about our senses, we've got kind of our visual, our sense of sight, auditory, our hearing, touch, our smell, our taste. Vestibular is your balance. Proprioception is the messages that come back from like your joints and your muscles. And interoception is the messages that come from inside your body. So this can be things like, you know, do I need the loo? You know, I've got a bit of a headache, but it can also be like, you know, your body telling you what your emotional state is. So often we understand our emotional state by the cues that are coming through our body, you know. So these are the senses that we talk about. These are the senses that an occupational therapist would be looking at if they start to work with somebody. Each of these can be broken down. So for visual, you have the light that comes into our eyes, but we're looking for movement, the intensity of the light, so how bright it is, how dim it is, color, shapes. We're picking all of these things out all the time. It's the same auditory, you've got kind of pitch, loudness. Touch is really interesting. So touch, we have discriminative touch, which is when we touch things to kind of work out like their shape, how hot they are, you know, are they rough, are they smooth? We have deep touch, which is when deep pressure that you get in massages and things, which people can access sometimes through hammocks. People often find that really calming, really nice. You also have social touch, which a lot of people don't really know about. So social touch is basically pathways which respond to the touch from another human. So these are actually moving along different kind of parts of our nervous system. It's not particularly widely well known about, but it's quite an interesting thing that you may notice if you're working with autistic people, is that some people will seek discriminative touch. They might be picking up things and rubbing them between their fingers in the woods a lot, but they don't like to be touched by another person. That's actually on a different kind of sensory circuit. So sometimes you have people who will seek one type of touch, but be hypersensitive and really not like another. What I've seen happen in my own practice is people being denied quite a lot of opportunities because they're thought to be very touch sensitive, but actually they're sensitive to a particular type of touch. They're sensitive to that kind of social touch. It's really interesting, but this is kind of shows you the complexity of actually trying to work out what's going on with somebody from sensory observations, and why we need to be quite aware of the limits of our competency. And obviously a lot of these are connected as well. So like your visual and your vestibular, they're both connected. We kind of, most people know that like your smell and your taste are very connected. And then we're constantly kind of filtering what's important. So as well as kind of integrating what's going on, we're also working out what we need to pay attention to, some of which is kind of automatic processes. Others will be to do with our own kind of preferences, previous experiences and history. So it's really complicated kind of process going on all the time. Our senses basically connect us to the world and to ourselves. If our self is a big lump of clay, our senses are the hands that shape us. It really is that kind of central to who we are, our sensory experience. So there's all kinds of sensory differences that somebody might have. The most kind of common things are probably hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity, which means there's either too much information traveling on the sensory channel or not enough. So you may be trying to avoid something, finding it too intense, or you may be seeking something because you need to kind of balance your input. You're not really getting enough. Also, the filtering that we mentioned earlier. Sometimes autistic people will find it difficult to kind of parse out that, what is the more kind of salient information from their senses, and so there'll be differences in processing like that sometimes. Like I said before, this all fluctuates. So you can see how complicated it is. So these are some of the tips I give for observing sensory differences. Really, one of the most important ones I'd say is to see if you can spend some time on your site alone and be mindful of each of the senses that we just spoke about. Try some of the different activities, some of the things that you see people doing, and think about all of the senses and what you're engaging. And if you're actually more mindful of the fact that, for instance, if you're lifting something up, you're getting a lot of information from proprioception. You also got basically your kind of vision, your depth perception to work out how to actually pick it up. And then you've got all the information coming back about how heavy it is. You've got the discriminative touch telling you what it feels like. So if you actually kind of break down your own experience a little bit, it gives you a little bit more insight into other people's, because we don't necessarily think about all of our senses a lot of the time. That's part of that kind of filtering and editing that we do. Also, if you see people doing things, it's worth sometimes having a go at it yourself. So for instance, if you see somebody toe walking, it can be hard to know exactly what someone's getting out of that, but you'll know straight away if you try toe walking yourself. You'll notice that you're getting a lot more proprioceptive input from your legs. So that can be a way to kind of balance your proprioceptive input. I would say record what you see without assumption. So don't say, I've seen somebody toe walking, therefore it must be proprioceptive. Just think about the fact that you need to actually just be saying, well, this is what I see today, because somebody may be toe walking one day because they're just playing, Someone might have watched RuPaul's Drag Race the night before and just be imagining that they're on a pair of massive high heels. Do you know what I mean? This is kind of, don't assume that because you've seen something once or twice, it means that there's a sensory difference. You're looking for patterns and evidence over time, and also sharing those with any of the partners that you're working with. Right, so you've got responding to sensory challenges. So this can be really difficult. You might need input from an occupational therapist, really. But if you're not getting that help, this is just a little bit of kind of advice of how to go about things. So the most important thing at the beginning is don't invalidate an experience because you don't understand it. So just because it's not a kind of sensory experience you're familiar with, it doesn't make sense to you. Don't tell somebody that they're making a fuss, that they're being silly. You need to actually understand that something might be really intensely unpleasant for somebody. And just because your sensory processing isn't working in the same way doesn't mean that they're not having a really difficult time. So again, be aware of existing individual accommodations or strategies. Now, it's worth carrying out a sensory audit of your site and activities. Ideally, this would be done by an occupational therapist. And to really be a proper sensory audit, it would be carried out by an occupational therapist. If you're not able to get that input, you can just Google sensory audit and you'll find quite a lot of examples of the kind of tick lists that people use. They're generally set up for a classroom, but it will at least give you an idea of what to look for and what to be aware of. So you're kind of doing it just so you're kind of aware that as someone moves around your site and the different activities you offer, what kind of sensory differences and what kind of sensory input people might be getting. Try to recognise and facilitate self-regulation. That's really important. This is often stimming. So a lot of the kind of movements, things that you see people do, you may find that that's actually a way for somebody to self-regulate, to kind of balance up their sensory processing if they're not getting enough input from one way by moving. That's really kind of helpful. Sometimes squeezing things to get proprioceptive input. Just kind of, if you recognise that, don't see that as something to kind of stop people from doing. Sometimes if people really doesn't like anything, what you're looking for, if someone has a real aversion, it's finding something too intense, but you can't completely take it away. Can you give any predictability and control over something? So that can be, one example would be if you were going to give a round of applause and somebody didn't like the sound, you can say to people, okay, there's going to be a round of applause, but it's going to count for 3, 1, 2, 3, and it's finished. And that can actually help people. The fact that they know when something's going to stop. I mean, dentists do something similar with us, don't they? You know, if they have your teeth done, sometimes, you know, if you're frightened, the dentist uses that as a way of kind of helping you feel a bit more predictability and control, and it can make those things a little bit easier for people. So be mindful of and provide ways to reduce stimuli. So Andy, that would just be a question of being able to put his head up and put his glasses on. For some people may want to have a blackout tent, or a hammock you can zip yourself into can remove a lot of visual stimuli. Sometimes just moving to a quieter bit of the woods for someone who doesn't like noise, just recognizing that maybe they need to kind of regulate by moving away from the noise. Other people may have kind of headphones or kind of ear defenders that they put on. This is quite an important one. Be aware of overstimulation and have strategies to calm. So we've talked about it being a really rich sensory environment. One of the things we have to be particularly careful of, I think, is tree swings. Proprioception, I think it's always seems to be calming, but vestibular is really stimulating. So 1 minute too much of vestibular input can cause hours of dysregulation for the child. 15 minutes of vestibular input can have a 6 to 8 hour effect on the brain, positive or negative, depending on how the brain processes the information. So if you see a pattern of somebody going on a tree swing and then being really kind of overstimulated when they come off, maybe becoming very over emotional, just be aware that you may actually be overstimulating somebody when they do that. The other thing, if you're kind of responding to sensory challenges, that I'd recommend is be flexible and think outside the box. Quite often the kind of solutions can be right there if you're not being almost too literal, really, interestingly enough. If the neurotypical person is flexible in the way they think. So for instance, if someone won't wear a raincoat, but they will wear like a soft fleece, can they have an umbrella? If somebody finds it difficult to sit near the fire, can you give them a hot water bottle in the winter so they can sit a bit further away? All of these kind of ways of just thinking, well, how can somebody get the benefit that we're looking for in a different way from what's being offered, if they're finding it difficult to get that due to sensory reasons. So
yeah, so over to me. So when we're looking at sensory challenges, I actually spoke to young people in our community, and about 40 young people shared their views about what's difficult in outdoor environments. And there were 3 main things that I mentioned, so I thought I'd cover them. The first one is insects. I've got a picture of a moth there because I love to sleep in hammocks when I go and visit friends. I went to see someone a few weeks ago. Accidentally left the net undone in my hammock when I went in to go to the toilet. I came back and there was about 10 moths on my hammock and I could not get them all out and I got really stressed out. And now I have a bit of a hatred for moths, but I'll get over it. So lots of young people say that they find insects very difficult. But interestingly, not all the time, because as Michael mentioned earlier, when you're in a flow state, a lot of your typical sort of worries or things you're mindful of aren't always a difficulty. There's a young person who comes to our forest school. But well, it's interesting. So Lisa, who's here today, actually facilitated our last forest school session. So yes, hello. There's a young person. So we're in Manchester, And there's a young person who loves our sessions so much, he travels from Newcastle once a month to come and visit. But his mum thought he'd never be able to attend because he has a huge phobia of insects. But then what happens is he enjoys the sessions so much that he sort of forgets about it. And I was really interested in seeing how the last session went, because at Lisa's site, there's a beehive on it, but it wasn't able to make it anyway. But when people are in that flow state, it can actually make things like that a lot easier. If there is distressing sensory input, but you're doing something you really, really enjoy and you're flourishing sort of in the moment, it can make difficult sensory experiences a bit easier. So yeah, I don't have any other answer for insects. If anyone has an answer for how to make insects upset people less, feel free to share them. But yeah, the second thing I've got here is about unpredictability. But that is the environment. Each time you go to a forest school, it's a different time of the year. It looks different, it feels different, it's a different temperature. And having that unpredictability of not knowing what it's going to be like can be really difficult for people sometimes. But a simple fix for that could be just sharing a bit of information about how the site changes during the year and making sure people have that information to go with things as we go, if that makes sense. But other thing that people talk about is the unpredictability of the weather. That might be a bit different for people who don't live in Manchester. But here, I don't think there's such thing as a day where it doesn't both rain and have sun at the same time. We've had one forest school session ever where I felt like it didn't go well, and that's because the weather forecast predicted it would be sunny all day, and then at about 1 o'clock it started absolutely pouring down, and then we had no shelters set up, and the young people were very, very, very upset. But that goes back to what I said before about having a plan B. That includes having a weather plan B as well. So since then, I've tended to put shelters up even if it says it's a sunny day, because unpredictable things can be quite a nightmare. But the biggest thing young people said they find difficult in outdoor environments is other people. It could be that the people don't understand them very well and their behaviours. So educating people about autism and acceptance is really, really helpful and important. And yeah, but when we asked in general, what is the main reason you might not venture outdoors? And the main thing people said was just other people. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting to mention. So number 6 is understanding meltdowns. I think this is so important. I was going to talk about the neuroscience of meltdowns, but when I realized we're not going to have time, so I'm just going to skip that and then go to the main thing that you need to know, which is no young person chooses to have meltdowns. And these quotes from our community members that explain how they feel, I think pretty much prove that. So one person said, when they have a meltdown, it's like the raging monster in you lets itself loose. Sometimes it feels like all I can do is stand and watch or listen to whatever's going on. Other times, I just feel out of place and want to disappear. I feel like my world is crumbling before me and feel like I've lost control. They feel like an uncontrollable explosion of emotions. No coping strategy or convincing could be used or work. It makes everything harder and can't do anything. Nothing makes sense, and there's so much anger, confusion, and sadness. I've got more quotes, but I'll send the slides because there's quite a lot. The important thing to mention here is people don't just have meltdowns. There's also something called a shutdown, which is where, you know, when you become really overwhelmed, your brain goes into survival mode. So the prefrontal cortex, the part that's involved with decision making and logic and problem solving, stops working, and the middle part of your brain, the limbic system, completely takes control. When that part of your brain takes control, what matters is survival and keeping yourself safe. If you're in that threatening mode, you can have fight and flight mode. That's when you can become very angry or trash things or make demands of people or run away to try and escape. That's your body saying, I don't feel safe right now, and I'm going to do something to keep myself safe. What can happen sometimes is you enter what's called freeze mode or fawn mode. So freeze mode is where you feel completely frozen or stuck or unable to do things. And fawn is where you become completely submissive and do whatever's asked, and you're a people pleaser. While they're easier for you to tolerate, they're actually more difficult for a young person, because that's your brain saying, I don't feel safe right now, and I'm unable to keep myself safe. So I'm going into freeze and fawn mode and waiting to see what happens. So even though it's easier for you, that is much more distressing and difficult for a young person. So if someone's in shutdown or are very withdrawn, that could mean that they're struggling immensely and they need just as much support as someone who might appear quite violent or aggressive. Yeah. So if someone has a meltdown, what helps? Of course, I'm a Studio 3 ambassador, so I deliver low arousal training, which is normally 3 hours. And of course, we're not going to go through it for 3 hours today. So I wanted to share a summary and just say, if you want to learn more, Studio 3 does very cheap training on Friday mornings around the low arousal approach. But yeah. So one of the key principles around this is if a young person's struggling, punishing them and focusing just on behavior does not work. As I said just then, when you're so highly stressed, the logical part of your brain does not work and you're at the point of no return. So when someone's highly stressed, it's really important to focus on what's needed to help them become calm and relaxed. It's important to talk about what went wrong, what can help, what can you change to stop it from happening again. But until they feel safe, it isn't possible to actually do that. I also wanted to mention a bit here about restraint, because sometimes when people are really struggling, people say that restraint is a good thing to keep people safe. We do not believe in restraining people and never, ever will, because a lot of young people who come to our community have struggled so much with trauma, losing trust with the people around them because they have been restrained. As I said earlier, your body goes into fight or flight mode. If you don't feel safe, you're in the same survival mode as if you're in life-threatening danger. Even if a place feels harmless, how you feel on the inside is still exactly the same. If you're in a situation where you don't feel safe and someone restrains you and makes you feel completely powerless, that leads to feelings of sheer terror and overwhelm, which can take a very long time to recover from. Not just does it cause trauma, but also losing trust, relationships with those people. And as we said before, having relationships with people is key. So what can you do instead? I'm going to just go through a few different strategies, which are part of the low arousal approach, which is about strategies and things you can do to help someone become calmer and relaxed without restraint and seclusion. The first one is stay calm. Or someone said, that's really interesting because one of my young people has identified restraint helps him regulate and reach baseline again. Yeah, and that does make sense. Because if you're restraining someone, that can give deep pressure input, which can have a really calming effect on people. But it's really important to look at it in a case-by-case basis. It's a very, very minority number of people who say that it has a calming effect at that time, because the important thing to remember is when your survival brain mode is activated, you perceive everything differently. So even if someone does something like doing a wave, when you're calm and relaxed, that's fine. Leah, I think you're drawing on a whiteboard. I'm going to quickly remove it. Oh, that's okay. Oh, I can't. I think you might have to. It's fine. We'll leave it there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm coming back onto that in a separate point anyway. Yeah. Thank you for taking it off. What was I going to say? Yeah. Yeah. I'll come on to it. I'll come on to it. Thank you. So the first strategy we've got is stay calm. Of course, that is much easier said than done. But what people tend to have is what's called the emotional contagion effect. So if someone's really, really stressed, if someone's really stressed and then they see that you're also stressed, that can then make them feel more stressed, and the stress gets higher and higher and higher. What's really important to know is, what's typically said in low arousal training is the principle of fake it till you make it. So even if you're really worried or anxious or terrified, it's really important to try and look calm and confident, because then that person is distressed will start to think, oh, okay, things are okay. That person there looks fine. Things are going to get better. And that's really, really helpful. But actually, a lot of autistic people say fake it till you make it doesn't work, because some people are very, very sensitive to emotions and have high levels of empathy. So you see someone look calm and relaxed, but you feel that they aren't, and that can leave a really confusing message. So what we say instead is stay calm. And what we mean by this is learning strategies for self-care and little techniques that you can do to make yourself calm before going into a situation. So if a young person's in crisis, try not to rush straight in and try and resolve it. Instead, have a few deep breaths, use whatever strategy works for you, and then go in there with the knowledge that in the future they will become calm and relaxed again, and use that as a way to stay calm, if that makes sense. My second point is use distractions. And this is quite an interesting thing because it takes a lot of creativity to do it in the right way. Because if someone's really stressed and you say, oh, I don't know, tell me about Pokemon, they might get really, really angry because it could look like you're dismissing them or don't really care about how they're feeling at that time. So I think it's an art to learn how to do distractions in the right way. So one thing that I normally do is always give sort of a couple of minutes for people to sort of get out whatever they're feeling at that time and then come up with a way to do it. It could be talking to someone nearby about an interest that person also likes, and then something could click and they start to get involved with a discussion. With a lot of autistic people, they have special interests. So if you talk to someone about a special interest, that could instantly capture someone's attention and they'll still be really stressed or dysregulated, but getting involved in that discussion helps you to break out of that meltdown bubble and can help with becoming calm again. Sometimes what I do at Forest School, even though a lot of people have against technology, is I know one thing that I have is lots and lots of really, really funny videos. So if someone's really stressed, I'll just put a funny YouTube video on and then we can watch it together. Sometimes that works for some people. And because the focus at that time is making sure they become relaxed as quickly as possible. The next thing is avoid direct eye contact. As you all know, a lot of autistic people struggle with eye contact anyway. Not everyone does, but a lot of the time when people use eye contact without realizing it, it feels like people do it to assert power or dominance or control over someone. So eye contact can be really, really overwhelming, not just because you can feel emotions through people's eyes, but because of how people use it as well. So trying to avoid eye contact can be really helpful when someone's highly stressed. The next point, which Richard mentioned a little bit before, is know the things that you try and do to help may appear as a threat. So if you want to put your hand on someone's shoulder, which is normally a calming movement that you can do, if someone's really, really stressed and they're in survival mode, things like that could be perceived as a threat. So it could feel like you're grabbing them or you're trying to stop them from doing something. And that can be really difficult for someone. So other things around this is be aware about gestures. They can be misinterpreted too. I feel like most people here might experience this, but if you're really stressed or anxious and you hear someone laughing, even if they're with a group of friends, it can feel like they're laughing at you. Most of the time they're not, but because you're stressed, you perceive it that way. So even if you're doing something that's very nice or friendly or positive, it can be perceived as threatening, which can make things more difficult. It's really important to slow your movement down. Be aware gestures can be misinterpreted, but also keep your distance. What I mean by that is everyone has a certain amount of space that they need to feel comfortable. And if you get in that space, that can make someone really stressed. But that space also changes depending on how you feel. I don't know if people would have noticed this, but especially during COVID, everyone's personal safety bubble got much bigger. So before COVID, you might have been a bit more comfortable with people being quite close to you in a shopping queue or something. But after COVID, you might still feel quite uncomfortable if people get a little bit too close. So you have different levels of comfort depending on how you feel. If you're really stressed, you need a much bigger comfort zone. But other things to mention here as well is if someone's having a fight response, you don't want to get too close anyway, so they don't punch you. So that's also a good thing to be mindful of. Yeah. The next point is avoid gathering staff. If you have too many people around, you have the audience effect, which makes the situation feel a bit more like a performance. You feel like people are watching you, and that can make things a lot more difficult. What I always say is if someone's in crisis, you should only have one person speaking to and responding to them at a time. One reason is to make it feel like there's less people watching. The second reason is if there's two different people trying to help and they're both saying different things, it can be really, really overwhelming because when you're really stressed, you might only be able to manage one set of instructions or things people are saying at a time. One thing I find really helpful is if someone's struggling. Well, when I run sessions, if someone's in crisis, it's normally me who goes and tries to support someone with it. But there tends to always be a backup person. And what I say is just be sort of around the corner or out of the way, but be attentive. And then if I need support from them, I can have a signal or a sign to do that. And rather than them coming over as well, swap over so there's still only one person, because otherwise it can feel really difficult still. The other point here is removing other people from a situation. I think a lot of the time what people tend to do is try and move the person who's distressed. But if you're in that survival mode, any attempt to move them is going to make them become even more stressed. It's much, much easier to move the other people who might be calmer out of the way and leave that person where they are until they're relaxed later on. The other little tip that I have here is something that has the name, it's quite a funny name, of the Pied Piper method, which is that if a young person's in crisis and they're really upset and you're the person supporting them, they might then be really focused on you and what you're saying. So then if you're struggling to move other people out the way, if you start to move backwards, they might start to follow you. So that's another safe way to get someone out of the environment so there's less people around. Without putting any demands or imposing something on someone who's really stressed. A final point here is tactically withdraw yourself from a situation. What to mean by that is if someone's really, really stressed, they need control to get themselves to a sense of safety. And I'm sure everyone here will know what it's like when someone's really stressed. You also feel really stressed, so you want control of a situation. And then you can get into a bit of a power battle where a young person's demanding something, and then you need something as well. But if they're in meltdown mode, what's going to happen is you're both going to get more and more and more and more stressed, and you're going to get into a standoff. So it's okay to be lenient and not to go for power for now, because repair comes afterwards at a later stage. So tactically withdrawing yourself, you don't have to always be in control. The focus right now is helping the person to become relaxed. 3 more things, sorry. Next one is reduce demands. We'll come on to demand avoidance soon. One after that is be flexible with the rules. If someone is in overload or really, really stressed or upset, and then as a result, they start saying, fuck you, I hate you, and that sort of stuff, you know, we always say that we don't really have swearing at our sessions, but then if you tell someone off for swearing while they're in survival mode, they're then just going to get even more stressed, and it just never ever helps. So it's okay to be flexible with some rules for now, because your focus is getting them to remain calm. If you do try to focus on getting them to stick to every rule, when they're not able to think rationally and logically, it's just going to escalate the situation even more. And the final thing is remove environmental triggers. Normally, when someone has reached meltdown mode, it's because there are triggers in the environment that have led to them feeling that way. So it's important to see if you can work out what those are and remove them. But the other thing to know is if you have a high level of stress, your sensitivities increase as well. So some things that could be fine, like people chattering, can be really, really difficult when you're really overwhelmed. One of my personal favorite regulation strategies is going to the woods that are nearby, and I'll just go on a walk through. If I've had a really bad day and my stress is really high, I'm not able to do that because things like the birds making noises and the leaves rustling with the wind, they really, really hurt I feel a lot of sensory pain from that if I'm really, really stressed. So be mindful that some things that seem harmless can be much more difficult at that time. So you've put these strategies into place, that person's feeling more calm and more relaxed. What next? It's important to remember they might not be able to talk about it straight away. Even if someone looks like they're calm, the stress doesn't fully leave your body until about 45 minutes after that situation. The way we do things, if someone's been really upset, we always wait until the next day to talk to someone, because you're still going to have stress and you're still going to really be struggling at that time. The other reason for this is young people don't want to have meltdowns. They're a horrible thing to experience. And sometimes they can be quite destructive as well. So after you've had one, people always feel guilt, shame, embarrassment, and other really, really negative feelings. And it can be really difficult to come to terms with that. Final thing here is to say, after someone has really struggled, having a restorative conversation is always really, really important. But they're really difficult to start. Whenever I start one, I feel such intense discomfort, but you still have to do it, and it's really, really needed, because that short-term discomfort means that you can make changes to best meet their needs in the long term. If someone has a meltdown and then you don't talk about it ever again, there will be tension or a bit of a lack of trust and other feelings that need to be resolved. So yeah, that's really important to mention. Number 7 is reflection. I think I'm starting with this. There's only 8 minutes left, Michael. What do we do? How about I'll say, yeah, we've got 4 more sections to go through. So what I'll say is, if people have to leave at 9, that is absolutely perfectly fine. We're going to record the meeting anyway, so we can send it over if people want to watch the rest at a different time. You think that sounds okay, Michael?
Yeah, sounds
Can
good
we
to
keep
me,
going?
Andy.
Yeah. And I won't talk too much. So yeah, thank you. So the next section is reflection. For me, I'm focusing on reflection after a meltdown. The important things here, as I said, people feel quite a lot of guilt, upset, and shame. People can feel quite empty and tired. One of the main ones for me is guilty and reflective, regretful that I would have just stopped it if I could. So it can be really difficult to deal with how you feel after a meltdown. So what helps? We've got a bit of a three-step approach for how to help people after a meltdown has happened. The first one is, if someone is struggling or they've reached crisis, assume there's a good reason why, because no one chooses to do that. It's really important to understand what their reasoning is. For me, the empathy step is about focusing not on what you're upset about or what you've been stressed about, focus solely on the young person. So I'm sorry about what happened yesterday. Do you want to talk more about what made you feel that way? At this time, try your best to understand their perspective and show you're trying by asking questions. Those questions should show you've processed what they said, but also that you'd like to understand more. Sometimes people think listening and empathy is about saying, I'm sorry that happened, or saying that you understand. True listening and empathy is about asking questions that explore deeper, proving that you've listened to what they said. And this feeling listened to is really, really important for being able to move forward together. So at this point, it's really important to stay impartial and out of judgment, even if they're in the wrong, even if you're really, really mad about what they've done. Being able to making sure they feel completely heard is really important for that restorative conversation. The next step is about sharing the context. So once you've fully heard a young person, what's made them upset, then we want to look at, why do we want to problem solve with a young person? We need to show that the young person is important to us, but also share the perspectives of other people. If someone's had a meltdown, I first listen to the reasons why, and then I'll always talk about two things. One is how the issue is affecting them. It must have been really difficult to experience that meltdown. The other thing to be mindful of is their friends and peers might struggle with meltdowns as well. And you say, I'm a bit worried that if something like that happens again, your friends might become a bit sort of wary or anxious or upset by something like that. Sorry, I'm not explaining very well because I just looked at the time. But the important thing again is how the issue affects others. So first step is young people sharing their perspective. The second step is sharing your perspective, but at the same time, showing that the young person's coming first. When I want to problem solve with young people, the reason is I really, really want our forest school to work for them. So even though I'm sharing my concerns, it's my concerns about their well-being and what's helpful for them as well. So once you've done that, the third step is about teamwork. So just looking at behavior and sort of having a punishment for that only creates a short-term change and doesn't meet the underlying reason behind why someone's struggling. We understand that when young people struggle, we need to address the root cause. And the best way to do this is by working together. So at this point, you've heard each other, and then you can say, okay, what next? What can we do now? Some key principles when doing this. The first one is, don't just put the onus on the young person. Working in partnership with young people means being willing to accept not everything you do is going to be right, and there's things you can do differently as well. So I always believe in not just focusing on what the young person can do, what they can add to their toolbox when they're feeling dysregulated, but also what can we do to offer better support to that young person. The next thing is about working out the probability of the solution being successful. You could come up with ideas together, but if it isn't going to work, there's no point in trying it. So have that discussion about how likely do you think this will help. The third thing is, remember, you should focus on solutions that focus on meeting needs or fixing underlying reasons. There's been quite a few times with young people where they felt so much shame and embarrassment that they feel like they deserve a punishment. So they'll say, how about you just don't let me attend for the next 3 months as a punishment for how I've acted. But that doesn't fix anything. That's just because they've really struggled with the feelings of shame that come after a meltdown. It isn't going to fix the underlying reasons behind why they've struggled. So for me, I don't accept something like that as a meaningful solution. The fourth thing is you don't have to come up with a solution straight away. You can say you've had this discussion for now. I'll take some time to think, and then we can come back and discuss it again. I've gone through that very quickly. So when it's Michael's turn, I'm going to put a link in the chat because we've made a draft guide to meltdowns, so please don't share it with anyone yet because it's not finalized, but I'll send it in the chat because it goes through all of the principles in quite a lot more detail. So it might be really helpful. So number 8 is about demand avoidance. So why might someone be demand avoidant? It's sort of 3 sort of main reasons I wanted to mention. The first one is pathological demand avoidance. So this is something that people consider as part of the autism spectrum. And this is where you have a sort of internal need to avoid everyday demands, which is sort of fueled by anxiety. The important thing to mention here is this doesn't just include things you don't want to do, but it also includes things that you enjoy as well. So if someone asks you if you want to go to the park, even if it's something that you really, really enjoy, if it feels like a demand, you might not be able to do it. PDA is a huge topic, which again deserves a whole training course in itself. So instead, I'm going to put a link in the chat to something called a Panda approach from a PDA society that talks through some of the main strategies that are helpful if someone has a PDA profile. But other reasons why people might be quite demand avoidant are stress and also trauma as well. The reasons for this is, as I said earlier, when you're really, really stressed, the logical part of your brain doesn't work as well as it usually does, and you feel the need to be in control. So any demands you have can be perceived as threatening and much more difficult to tolerate. So many autistic people can face so many difficulties just to exist in the world because there's such a lack of misunderstanding that you can always be on a very, very high level of stress, which means that you might always be demand avoidant and struggle with things like that. But no matter the reason why someone's demand avoidant, the principles when supporting someone are the same. So a few things to mention here. One is focusing on well-being of that person. If someone attends your forest school sessions, they might struggle while they're there, but it might not always be because of a session itself. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone who's come and can't stay. I'm very sorry about overrunning. But yeah, so even if you've got a perfect routine in place at forest school, someone might still struggle at your sessions. And this could be because of a few reasons. They might not feel they have any meaningful friendships. They might struggle with loneliness overall. They might not accept their autism diagnosis yet. People are diagnosed when they're struggling or at crisis point. So it's normal for people to express sort of hatred or shame towards it. And that can have a really big impact on well-being. So focusing on well-being in the first instance for a young person is always really, really helpful. The second thing here is collaborative problem solving. So like I said earlier, our approach is about working in partnership with young people to solve problems. Because I feel that it's not always about demands, it's about the balance of power. If a young person knows that you value them as an equal partner and know you're willing to work collaboratively with them, then actually having a demand every now and again actually is a lot more tolerable and is okay for people. I'm not sure if I've explained that very well. But an example is I play in our gaming community, I play Sea of Thieves with young people quite a lot. And there's 3 young people I normally play with who have a diagnosis of PDA. But whenever they play, I'm always the captain of a ship. So I'm on the ship, we come against an enemy ship, and I'm always telling them what to do when we're on it. And they all do what I've said. But the reason for this is because even though I'm making demands, they know we have an equal relationship. So if I say anything, they know they're able to challenge it and I'm flexible and we can make changes. So even though I'm in control at that time, we still have that equal relationship, and that's why it works. The other point here is respect and trust is earned. A lot of autistic people don't respect someone because we're an authority figure. You have to earn it. So if a young person struggles with you, how do you rebuild connection? A really important thing I think it's important to be really conscious of is if someone struggles quite a lot and has had quite a lot of meltdowns or you've had some negative interactions together, then they might really struggle with you. But at the same time, you might think, oh no, they're here again. It's a person who's always causing trouble. I think it's really important to recognize that that happens, but also that there's meaningful things you can do to rebuild it. In spectrum gaming, sometimes some young people break the rules quite a lot, and then I think sometimes I mentally roll my eyes and think, oh my gosh, not again. If I get into a mindset that I'm doing that, that means I know I need to do something to rebuild that relationship. So can I take some time to have some one-to-one time with them and learn about their special interests? Can we have some time doing an activity together? Making sure you do something to break that tension and rebuild that relationship is really, really, really important. And once you do that, your mindset will change. You will no longer do the mental eye roll, and you can recognize that person as a positive, amazing person they are, because every young person is intrinsically amazing. So yeah. Now over to Michael. You're on mute, sorry.
Thank you, Andy. Right, we're going to talk about the idea of neuroharmony now. We're coming towards the end of our talk, and we're going to kind of tie it in and think about how we can reflect on the kind of attitudes and the frames we need to do better with our practice. So the idea of neuroharmony was thought up originally by Dr. Peter Vermeulen. Neuroharmony is a world where all the different neurotypes, which are the different types of thinking, complement each other with a harmonious society as a result. So this is a lovely idea, isn't it? And I know what you're all thinking. Well, Michael, that's really nice. Let's all go around and be nice to each other and the whole world will be fine. It's not that simple. It isn't, but we can look at some of the tools we can use, to, at least in our forest school, to move towards that. So what might neuroharmony actually look like? I'd suggest one of the first things that we need to actually take on board if we're forest school practitioners, or in fact for anybody who's working with autistic people, if you're neurotypical, which means all of the people who don't have any kind of neurodivergent diagnosis. Neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. There is no one right way of thinking, learning and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. This is a description basically of what's called the neurodiversity paradigm. If we put this idea at the center of our practice, we will end up with a much more effective forest school, we'll get better outcomes, and the people in your groups will basically do the best they can with you. So a good way that we can all start this if we're working with younger children is to stop pathologizing autistic play. If I was writing my book now, I think some of the language I used in my book was more to do with the medical model. So this is a really lovely graphic by a great Facebook group called autisticnotweird.com, which has loads of really good advice. Chris Bonello, who made this graphic, is an autistic teacher, and there's loads of really actually practical, useful things. So if you're on Facebook, it's worth following Chris. I'm autistic, did this all the time, and nobody has ever given me a decent reason for what's so bad about it. Too many people have the attitude of, it's an autistic trait, so therefore it must be negative. But I've never heard an actual legitimate reason why. Give us a break. This is fun and you should try it. This is such a good point. When you see this type of autistic play lining things up described, it's always described negatively. But actually, if somebody's having fun, if they're learning things from it, all of the types of things that you would see in neurotypical play are in this type of play. During lockdown, when a lot of us were home educating, we've been sent videos by the schools and stuff. I was doing some home ed with my daughter, and we were being sent videos to encourage people, like all children, to learn a little bit about coding when they were quite young. And that all seemed to involve games where people lined things up and created those kind of sequences and patterns that we see in autistic play. So don't pathologize autistic play. If you want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the ideas around autistic play and autistic play culture, I would recommend that you go on the Forest School Association blog and read Stefania Donzelli's article, Autistic Play at Forest School. This is a quote from Stefania: recognizing autistic development as valid and appreciating and accommodating autistic play differences at Forest School will not make autistic children more typical. Instead, it has the potential to avoid their disablement, support their growth into competent and confident autistic adults, and promote reciprocal understanding between autistic and neurotypical children. So when we have a look at what we have going on in our groups at Forest School, think about some of the different ways that we actually make connections with one another, regardless of neurotypes, just the way that all the different people you have come into your sessions make connections. You'll find that quite a lot of them are things that actually can happen across neurotypes. We often just look at the kind of ways that autistic people struggle, but we don't look at the ways that autistic people are doing okay, and the ways that they can bond and be with other people without it actually affecting any of the differences in the way that we communicate. So just sharing space with each other is quite a good way to actually be together. These ideas of being and doing that we have in Forest School are really important. So we're sharing space. You can teach people to value difference. I mean, the woods are probably the best place to take somebody if you want them to understand about the diversity of people in an experiential way. If you walk through my woods, there's quite a lot of hazel. There's no two hazel trees in my woods look exactly the same. They all look different. They're different shapes. They're in different places. Although the leaves are kind of the same, every single leaf on the tree isn't the same. You can actually show people that difference is a normal, natural thing. It's a really valuable thing we can do at Forest School. And there's a lot of communication actually in doing things together. So you can see here that people sawing some wood together. This is a cooperative thing. There's no need for language. Tone of voice doesn't matter. Body language, facial expressions don't matter, but the people are very much together in a rhythm together, doing something together. And this is a really nice way for people to be together, to bond, to understand each other. There's lots of other things like parallel play, parallel activity is quite normal, which is kind of what's happening to some degree here, people doing things together. And also people can have valued roles within the group. Some autistic people can find the whole kind of social hullabaloo of a Forest School session quite overwhelming. One thing that can help with that is sometimes if someone has a particular job, like in the background of this photo, you can see a yellow bucket. That's my kind of water bucket for the fire. So somebody has a job of walking down to the field, to the trough to get that water bucket. That's an important job, which is valued. That's really helping the group. It's taking part, it's being part of the group, and it's fitting in and having a community where despite our differences, we all fit in, we all can be valued, we can all contribute something. Big thing for a lot of autistic people, we've mentioned special interests earlier. Something I've noticed is that in communities that kind of are around an interest, where lots of people are really into something, you often find that the autistic members of those communities are really valued for their passion, for their knowledge, for their competence around whatever it is that everybody else is into. So I suppose the cliche is steam engines, isn't it, for a lot of autistic people? People think, oh yeah, no, autistic people don't work steam engines. Well, actually, I've met people with all kinds of special interests. There's a whopping great big sound system here, because I used to live in a community where one of my neighbours was autistic, and he was absolutely passionate about acid techno. He used to DJ at parties. He would talk to you as much as you could possibly listen to him about acid techno, and he was really respected in that whole community of people. He was a DJ, he had that kind of status within the community, and his massive amount of kind of, you know, his encyclopedia of knowledge about this quite niche subject made him really valued by the other people who were interested in it. So you need to kind of look for that a little bit at your Forest School. Can you find those kind of communities of interest? If somebody is bringing something they're really interested in into the woods that other people there are also interested in, that's a great way for that person to be valued. At Haller Wood with Deb Miller, I've met quite a few people who've come up through her Forest School who have actually gone on to have careers in working in bushcraft, tree surgery, because their special interests have actually, that they've developed while they've been working with Deb, have gone on to actually be careers for them, to ways for them to kind of express themselves with their special interests. Anyway, that's a really good way to kind of engage with people.
I'm going to skip this slide because this slide pretty much sums it up. So one of the biggest things when it comes to neuroharmony is recognizing that the ways autistic people may socialize and act aren't necessarily the wrong ones. So this quote says, again, from Chris Bonello, who's absolutely amazing. It says, I'm autistic, which means everyone around me has a disorder that makes them say things they don't mean, not care about structure, fail to hyper-focus on single important topics, have unreliable memories, drop weird hints, and creepily stay into my eyeballs. So why do people say you're the weird one? Because there's more of them than me. One of the most interesting things about running a community for autistic young people that's run by autistic adults is actually, despite how they're typically perceived, people do sort of socialize and connect really, really well with each other naturally as they are as autistic people. Of course, everyone has fallouts and needs support with certain things, but overall, actually, there's very, very strong levels of connection with autistic young people in our community. So a lot of things that are typically seen as wrong are just different, and a lot of autistic people are similarly different. So that's really, really epic. Yeah, I had a video that explained it, but I'll send it later instead because it's 4 minutes. Yeah, there you go.
Right. So this is ending our talk, really. Our community, by which I mean the Forest School community, moving the frame. So we've really tried to get as much information over to you this evening as we can. As we said at the beginning, it's a massive subject. I'm sorry we've overrun a little bit, but we really wanted to tell you as much as we possibly could. So I'll just finish by saying that we've kind of concentrated this evening on the idea of autistic people being the learners at Forest School. This, from the very outset of Forest School, is not really the story of Forest School. There's lots of autistic and other neurodivergent Forest School practitioners, parents. Even in my own practice, there'll be support staff, TAs who are autistic who've come along. At every level of Forest School, there's people, not just autistic people, but also other neurodivergent conditions, ADHD, etc., etc. So really, we are a neurodiverse community, and that is the strength of Forest School. We need to recognise that and actually say Forest School wasn't developed as an intervention, it wasn't developed as a therapy. It can just as much be a career. I think I'll be able to finally start. If you get really fed up, if you had too much listening to me, I'll tell you how to get rid of me forever. Is the day that we have one of these kind of talks, which is a neurodivergent Forest School practitioner talking about how to provide Forest School sessions for neurotypical children. That's when we've really reached the point that we should be at, I think. So if you are neurodivergent yourself, and I always assume that at least some of the people who come along and listen to these kind of talks are, if you're part of a neurodiverse family, you're a parent of neurodivergent children, really value the knowledge you have about yourself and about neurodivergence generally, and please stand up, take part in discussions, put yourself forward. If there's local Forest School Association groups, go along, talk about what you know. I think sometimes people don't realise the value in the knowledge that they have in their day-to-day lives. That's definitely the case when we talk about autism and when you see the parents of autistic children and also autistic people themselves, most importantly. We really need more and more of that knowledge. If we move forward as a community to co-produce the kind of resources that we need, which is what's happened this evening with me and Andy, we can all do it together and we can step forward and create a more inclusive, better type of environment for the young people that we work with. And that's where I kind of finished, but I'm happy to hang out and chat more. If anyone would like to ask questions, if there's any points we've raised, anything you'd like us to clarify or go into.
Yeah, and thank you so much everyone for coming. Other thing to mention is we're both at a Forest School conference. Is it next weekend? It is, isn't it?
Yeah, next weekend.
Yeah. And one thing I really, really love is being asked really challenging, deep questions. So feel free to come over and talk about autism and I'll talk your socks off. It was so hard to make this presentation so short. So yeah, please feel welcome to.
Come on. I don't get my...
Yeah, thank you for coming. You don't have to stay now, but also if anyone does want to ask anything, please ask. But yeah.
Daisy's asking, can you direct Daisy to any good resources for supporting autistic burnout? That's a really good question. That's a really good request.
Well, one thing I'll put in the chat, I have two things I'll put in the chat actually. One thing we've been working on is a Padlet board. So we've made something that's full of resources in alphabetical order. So if you go to B, there's a section on burnout that has resources on there. Other thing to mention is after we launch this Padlet, there is an organization called Not Finding School, who offer support to families of young people who are struggling to attend. And after they saw our Padlet, they've also made a Padlet, which focuses more on school-based things. But one of the main reasons people struggle to attend school is burnout. So there's also lots of epic resources on there. If I can find the link.